Here's something most people never really question. The institutions that print money are quietly buying gold, not announcing it loudly, not making dramatic moves, just steadily, month after month, increasing their holdings of something that sits completely outside the system they control. And that's where it gets interesting, because if anyone should have absolute confidence in paper money, it's them. They create it, they manage it, they defend it. So why would they be shifting into something that can't be printed, can't be adjusted, and doesn't rely on any policy decision? Pause for a second and think about that. This isn't a panic move. There's no urgency, no headlines screaming crisis. It's slow, controlled, almost routine. And that's exactly what makes it more important. Institutions at that level don't move without a reason, and they definitely don't move against their own system unless something deeper is changing underneath. They're not reacting to what's happening today. They're positioning for what comes next. And the gold itself isn't really the point. It's the signal behind it. Because when the people closest to the financial system start reducing their reliance on it, even quietly, you have to start asking a different kind of question. Not whether gold is a good investment, not whether prices will go up or down, but something much more fundamental. What did they see about the future of money that hasn't reached you yet?
To understand why this shift is happening, you have to look at the moment when trust quietly cracked. Not gradually, not theoretically, instantly. A clear example is the Russian foreign reserve freeze 2022. In one move, hundreds of billions in foreign reserves, assets that were assumed to be safe, liquid, and untouchable, were frozen. Not lost in the traditional sense, not stolen in a visible way, just made inaccessible. And that changed something fundamental. Because up until that point, holding reserves in major global currencies came with an assumption that no matter political disagreements, no matter tensions, those reserves were ultimately yours. They were part of the system, and the system would honor that ownership. But that assumption turned out to be conditional. Pause for a second, because this is the part most people overlook. When a central bank holds reserves in another country's currency, they don't actually hold physical cash sitting in a vault somewhere. They hold claims, entries in a system that someone else controls. And as long as that system functions normally, those claims behave like ownership. But when the system decides otherwise, those claims can be restricted. And that introduces something called counterparty risk, the risk that the party on the other side of your asset, the one holding, clearing, or recognizing it, can change the rules. Now imagine you're a central bank watching this unfold. You see that reserves, even at a sovereign level, can be frozen with a policy decision, that access can be removed without warning, that what you thought was a neutral system is actually governed by power. So you start adjusting. Not loudly, not all at once, but structurally. You reduce exposure to systems where your assets can be controlled externally. You diversify into things that don't depend on someone else's permission to access. And suddenly, physical gold starts to make more sense. Because gold doesn't sit inside someone else's database. It doesn't require a clearing system to validate it. It doesn't depend on a counterparty to exist. If you hold it physically, you control it. And that distinction becomes critical. Now zoom out. This isn't just about one event. It's about what that event revealed. It exposed the fact that the global financial system isn't purely neutral. It's conditional. It works smoothly most of the time, but under pressure, access can be influenced by political alignment, strategic decisions, or shifting priorities. And once that realization sets in, the behavior changes. Countries begin to rethink where they store value, not just based on return or liquidity, but on control. Because in a world where access can be restricted, control becomes more important than yield. This is the foundation of what people call de-dollarization. Not a sudden collapse, not a dramatic exit, a slow rebalancing. Away from reliance on a single system, toward assets that exist outside of it. And gold sits right at the center of that shift. not because it's perfect, but because it doesn't depend on trust in anyone else. If this shift feels sudden, it isn't. The pattern has shown up before, just in a quieter, slower form. You can see it clearly if you go back to the late 1960s and look at how Charles de Gaulle approached the global monetary system at the time. Back then, under the Bretton Woods framework, the US dollar was officially tied to gold. Countries could hold dollars as reserves, but in theory, those dollars were redeemable for physical metal at a fixed rate. On paper, it looked stable, but de Gaulle saw something most people didn't want to acknowledge. The US was issuing more dollars than it could realistically back with gold. Not overnight, not recklessly, but gradually, through deficits, through expansion, through the natural pressure of running the global reserve currency. And as those dollars spread across the world, foreign governments started holding increasing amounts of claims on US gold reserves. Pause for a second, because this is the same structural problem we keep coming back to. A system built on promises expanding faster than the underlying asset that's supposed to anchor it. De Gaulle didn't make a speech about collapse. He didn't try to panic markets. Instead, he acted. France began converting its dollar reserves into physical gold. Shipments of bullion moved quietly across the Atlantic, reducing exposure to paper claims and increasing control over something tangible. And this is where the pressure started to build. Because once one country begins redeeming, others start paying attention. If too many countries make the same move, the system can't hold. There simply isn't enough gold to satisfy all the outstanding claims at once. It becomes a race. Not officially, not publicly, but structurally. And that's exactly what happened. Confidence eroded. More countries began questioning whether their dollar reserves were as solid as they appeared, and eventually the pressure reached a point where the system had to change. In 1971, the US effectively closed the gold window. Convertibility ended. The link between the dollar and gold, at least in an official sense, was severed. Now pause again, because that moment matters more than it seems. It wasn't just a policy change, it was an admission that the system could no longer honor the original promise. And once that promise is broken, the nature of money changes. It shifts from something anchored to a physical constraint to something managed through policy, trust, and confidence. Now bring that forward. Today's system is entirely fiat. There's no formal link to gold, no redemption mechanism. Everything runs on confidence and coordination. And for decades that has worked, largely because the system is efficient, liquid, and deeply integrated. But the underlying tension hasn't disappeared. It's just taken a different form. Instead of a mismatch between dollars and gold, you now have a mismatch between expanding financial claims and the ability of the system to maintain trust under pressure. Debt levels grow, liquidity expands, promises increase. And most of the time that's manageable, until something tests it. That's what de Gaulle understood early. Not necessarily that the system would collapse immediately, but that it had limits. And when those limits are approached, the safest position isn't to rely on the promise, it's to hold what doesn't depend on it. Now think about how that connects to today. Central banks aren't redeeming dollars for gold anymore, because that mechanism doesn't exist. But they are doing something functionally similar. They're reducing reliance on paper claims and increasing exposure to physical assets that don't require trust in another party. It's the same instinct, just expressed differently. And this is the pattern. The people closest to the system tend to see its constraints earlier than everyone else, not because they predict the future perfectly, but because they understand how the structure works and where it can break under stress. They don't wait for the official announcement. They move before it, quietly. And by the time the change becomes obvious, the repositioning has already happened. Once trust in the existing system starts to weaken, countries don't suddenly walk away from it. They can't. The global financial system is too interconnected. Trade, payments, reserves, everything flows through established infrastructure. At the center of that sits organizations like SWIFT, which quietly coordinate how money moves across borders. And that's where the real leverage is, because control over the infrastructure means control over access. If you can be removed from that network, or even partially restricted, your ability to operate internationally becomes dependent on decisions you don't control. So instead of exiting the system, countries start building around it. Not loudly, not in a coordinated announcement, just gradually. Trade agreements begin shifting toward local currencies, payment channels are developed that don't rely entirely on traditional Western networks, settlement mechanisms are designed with one goal in mind. If access is ever restricted, there is another path. At first, these changes look minor, technical, easy to ignore, but they accumulate, and that's where things start to matter, because systems don't collapse in one moment, they get replaced in parallel. A second structure grows alongside the first, initially inefficient, fragmented, incomplete, but it doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to exist. Pause for a second and think about that. The moment an alternative exists, behavior changes. Countries no longer need to fully trust the main system, they just need to reduce dependence on it. Over time, usage increases, volume grows, and the alternative becomes more viable. Not dominant, but functional enough to matter, and that slowly weakens the original system's monopoly. Now layer gold into this picture. Gold isn't a payment system. It doesn't replace SWIFT or handle daily transactions, but it operates at a different level. It becomes a neutral reserve, something that doesn't rely on any network, any clearing system, or any third party's permission. It sits outside all of it. And in a world where multiple systems are emerging, that neutrality becomes valuable. Because if different countries are operating through different financial channels, you need something both sides recognize, something that doesn't belong to one system over another. That's where gold fits, not as currency, but as a bridge between systems that don't fully trust each other. Now zoom out. The existing system isn't disappearing. It's still dominant, still efficient, still widely used, but it's no longer the only option, and that's the real shift. From a single centralized structure to a more fragmented one where multiple systems overlap and compete. And in that kind of environment, power changes. It's no longer just about controlling the main network. It's about having alternatives, about being able to operate across systems or outside them entirely. And when you connect the dots, central banks accumulating gold, countries building parallel payment channels, trade slowly shifting structure, you start to see the pattern. None of these moves are dramatic on their own, but together they point to something much bigger, a gradual redesign of the financial architecture, not announced, not coordinated in public, but happening anyway. And once that kind of shift gets far enough along, it doesn't easily reverse. Because underneath all of this, trust, infrastructure, strategy, there's a deeper force pushing it forward. Not political, mathematical. Underneath everything we've talked about, trust breaking, systems fragmenting, gold being accumulated, there's a quieter force driving all of it. Math. More specifically, compound interest. Because national debt doesn't grow in a straight line, it compounds. Interest builds on top of interest year after year, and over time, that creates a curve that becomes very hard to control. At first, it's manageable. Governments borrow, economies grow, and the system balances itself. But as debt levels increase, the cost of maintaining that debt starts to accelerate. And this is where the problem begins. At a certain point, the system faces a constraint. You can either pay down the debt honestly, which requires higher taxes, reduced spending, and slower growth, or you can manage it another way. Historically, that other way tends to be inflation. Pause for a second, because this isn't usually presented as a direct choice. It's framed as stimulus, as necessary liquidity, as support during downturns. But the effect is similar. Expanding the money supply reduces the real value of existing debt. It doesn't eliminate it, but it makes it easier to carry. Now think about how central banks see this. They understand the math.
They see the trajectory, and they know that structurally, the system isn't designed to fully pay down its obligations. It's designed to roll them forward, to manage them, to keep them sustainable. But sustainability depends on confidence. If confidence holds, the system works. If it weakens, pressure builds. And this is where gold comes back into the picture. Not as a bet against the system collapsing overnight, but as a hedge against the long-term path the math is pushing toward. Because if debt continues to expand and the only viable response is to inflate it away, then holding assets that can't be created at will becomes a way to preserve value. Now zoom out. Central banks aren't buying gold because they expect an immediate breakdown. They're buying it because they understand the direction. The math doesn't reverse easily. Once debt reaches a certain scale, the options narrow, and the likely outcome becomes clearer over time, which leads to a simple but uncomfortable realization. The system doesn't need to fail dramatically to lose value. It just needs to keep working the way it already is.
So where does that leave you? Not in a position to predict when the system changes, and definitely not in a position to outmaneuver central banks. But you don't need to. The real takeaway isn't timing, it's structure. Because what these institutions are doing isn't speculation, it's positioning. Quietly adjusting their balance sheets so they're not fully dependent on a system they themselves understand has limits. And that's the part most people miss. They're not going all in on gold. They're diversifying away from total reliance on paper. So the practical version of that is much simpler than it sounds. You don't replace your entire portfolio. You don't abandon financial assets, but you carve out a small portion, something measured, intentional, and place it into something that exists outside the system, physical, not just on paper, something that doesn't depend on a counterparty to hold value. Pause for a second, because the goal here isn't to chase returns, it's to reduce exposure. That means understanding the difference between paper gold and physical gold. One is a claim, the other is possession. Central banks aren't buying ETFs, they're taking delivery. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Then there's storage. Not complicated, not extreme, but thought through. Accessibility, security, and most importantly, control. Because the whole point of this shift is removing reliance on someone else's promise. And finally, proportion. This isn't about making a dramatic move, it's about balance. A small allocation can change your risk profile more than people expect simply by existing outside the system. Because in the end, the lesson isn't buy gold. It's understand why they are. They're not reacting, they're preparing. And the question you're left with is simple. If the people who run the system are quietly stepping outside of it, how exposed are you to staying fully inside?